So we are continuing in Matthew 24 tonight, continuing the section of our study in King and Kingdom on the kingdom coming. Matthew 5 through 7 gives us the constitution of the kingdom, and now we're talking about the kingdom's coming. When will the kingdom come? That is the big question. And so as a review of last week, I do think it's important for us because there were some I know not here. You've already told me. I missed last week. I haven't watched the video. And so I do want to give us a bit of a robust review that we were all on the same page because I don't want anybody lost as we continue to wade deeper and deeper and deeper into Matthew 24 waters. And so the text immediately previous to Matthew 24, that being Matthew 23, and then the first three verses of Matthew 24 give us what is called the occasion of the discourse. Of course, Matthew 24 and 25 is a long teaching segment. And by occasion, I mean what is the reason that Jesus teaches the content contained in these two chapters. That is the occasion of the teaching. Well, the occasion is, of course, that Jesus is condemning, remember, 7 woes against the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees. He condemns them. And this is what I referred to as a formal rejection of Israel. Not to terminate God's plan with Israel, no, but to postpone it. That's important. Remember, I used the illustration of a VCR. If you want to pause the film, you simply reach up and press the pause button. In Matthew 23, that's what Jesus does. He presses the pause button toward the nation of Israel, and he's going to begin a new program. That's the church program. But here in the tribulation, in Matthew 24, Jesus reaches back up on that VCR and resumes the program for Israel. Didn't take the VCR tape out of the VCR, but leaves it in the VCR and presses resume. So his disciples come to him after hearing all of this and hearing where Jesus says not one stone will be left upon another in the temple complex, and they say, we've got some questions. His inner circle approach him and say, hey, 2 questions. Number 1, when will these things be? Help us to understand the timing of when this is going to happen. And I've given you here on your note slide, the answer to this first question is found in chapter 24, verse 32 to 51. We're going to get there in a couple weeks. But then the second question is an elongated question, yes. But the second question says, what will be the sign of your coming, even the end of the age? One singular question asked in 2 different ways. We might think about it that way. And Jesus answers the second question first. And he answers the second question in verses 4 through verse 31. Now, we looked at the first few verses of chapter 24 last week, verse 4 through 14. And what I told you in those verses is that I am a believer that verse 4 through 14 is partially fulfilled in our current age, what I've been calling the inter-Advent age, or sometimes called the church age. It is partially fulfilled now. Now, why do I say that? Because when I read the newspaper of today's world, the headlines look a whole lot like Matthew 24. You can't miss it. There are false teachers, false Christ, there are wars and rumors of wars, there are famines and earthquakes and martyrs and false prophets. There's increasing evil and loss of love, and there is also, thank God, there is also worldwide gospel preaching. Now, while it is partially fulfilled in this inter-Advent age, it is best for us to apply these verses specifically to the 7-year period of time known as the tribulation. Now, why did I say this? It hinges on this key term, birth pains. Birth pains, particularly in prophetic literature, what we find is birth pains is always associated with the day of the Lord. In other words, that time of judgment that is promised to be coming, the day of the Lord. And since that is the case, it is best for us to look at this within that 7-year period of time. So what I described was, verse 4 through 8, describe for us in very general terms. If we want specificity, we have to go elsewhere in the New Testament, particularly in Revelation. For example, chapter 6 describes in much more detail than Jesus gives us what the first 3.5 years are going to look like in the tribulation. But the scripture is very clear. It's 3.5 years. In fact, if you dig into this just a little bit, it goes specifically down to the day. 1,260 days or 42 months, 3.5 years. 3.5 years described for us in Matthew 24, verse 4 through 8. Now, this time period is initiated by one singular action, and it's initiated by a treaty agreement between two parties, the Antichrist and his government and the nation of Israel. The Antichrist and his government and the nation of Israel. And what the Antichrist promises Israel is they will enjoy tremendous peace. No one will ever come against them again because they are protected by this man of peace, this diplomatic genius that will step into human history and really, seemingly, solve all of the world's problems. So much so that Israel abandons their arms program. Israel abandons their self-protection. Why do they need it any longer? Because the Antichrist is pledged to protect them against everyone. During this time, as I said, this is where we see the seals of the tribulation be peeled back. This is where we see the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse released upon planet Earth to enact the wrath of God as it initiates during this period of time. All of this described in Revelation 6, verse 1 through 11. Again, we described this last week, but Revelation 6 and 7 matches so neatly to Matthew 24. And then we get to Matthew 24, verse 9 through 14. And this is where I say it matches so neatly the second half of the tribulation. Now, there's a noticeable shift in the text in verse 9. You can see it again if you would just look at that passage, and it's the word then. Then. It's a small word, somewhat insignificant word, but it's an important chronological word. And what it does is it shows us that there's a shift in the text. So where we've had the first 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years, now we're going to have the second 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. And this period is known in the scripture as the Great Tribulation. Not just tribulation, but great. And it's great because God's wrath is going to burn hotter and brighter during this time than planet Earth has ever experienced. It's known as the Great Tribulation. Now, what kicks off this time period? Well, interestingly enough, the first 3.5 years is kicked off or initiated by a signed treaty. The second 3.5 years is kicked off not by a signed treaty, but by a broken treaty. The Antichrist will break his agreement and break his treaty with Israel, and because of that, all hell will break loose on planet Earth. What is this time period known as? We discussed this in a lot of detail last week, but it's known as a great persecution. That's Daniel 7:25. This period is known for its Antichrist worship. We find this in the New Testament in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. The text tells us that many Jewish people will die as martyrs. We see people abandoning their faith. We see people betraying one another. We see false prophet deception. Want to see this in the book of Revelation? It's found in Revelation 13, verse 11 through 15. We see great wickedness and diminished love. But there's also two promises. We looked at these in detail last week as well. Promise number one is an endurance. It's the Greek word hypomeno. It means to maintain in the face of opposition, to stand one's ground, to hold out or endure. What the text tells us is that if you endure till the end, you will be saved. Verse 13. Now, to what is this referring? This is referring to those individuals who are not raptured, but come to faith in Christ after the rapture moment. They endure throughout all 7 years of tribulation. They're able to save their life on earth. They're able to get to the end of the tribulation period of time still alive. And to be saved is to be transferred into the millennial kingdom. They get to walk into the millennial kingdom as followers of Jesus. They'll be saved, delivered from judgment, and delivered into the kingdom of Christ. The second promise that we find here at the end, it's verse 14. It says that the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Friends, this is referring to the 7-year tribulation period of time. It's not referring to the church age. What Jesus is telling us is during the tribulation, the gospel will be preached. Specifically, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to every living person on the planet. What's the gospel of the kingdom? We find it in the Gospels quite often, actually. We find it in the mouth of Jesus. We find it in the mouth of John the Baptist. And it's this message: repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's the gospel of the kingdom. So before Jesus returns in his second coming, every person on the planet will hear the gospel. Now, the book of Revelation tells us how the world will respond to the gospel. Some will believe. In fact, not just some, many will believe. Many will be transferred into the millennial kingdom. Many will believe and become martyrs. We see this in the book of Tribulation, where there are some from every tribe, tongue, and nation standing before the throne of God, worshiping and praising Him. These are tribulation saints. We know that the gospel will bear fruit. We know that God's grace will extend. We know that God is going to continue to save, but many won't. Those that don't believe, there's several instances in Revelation where they curse the heavens. They cry out to the rocks and say, "Cover us and protect us from the wrath of God." They don't cry out in repentance. They cry out because of the pain of the wrath of God. They curse God. They don't turn to Him. The gospel will be preached. Now, is this fact an excuse for us not to get to work today? Of course it's not. I don't want anybody to taste the wrath of God. My enemy, my friend, my foe, it doesn't matter. I want everyone to come to the knowledge of Jesus and to a place of repentance in their heart. So we must get to work today. Amen? So that's our robust review. So now we get to the content of what we're studying today. And this is going to be verses 15 through 22. The kingdom coming, and specifically the sign. So we look at verses 15 and following. We're still in this section where Jesus is answering the question, what will be the sign of your coming? That's an important phrase. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Because the end of the age is Jesus' coming. It's the same. What is the sign? That's the question. So let's introduce the sign. So Matthew 24 through verse 22 describes for us the greatest discernible sign of Christ's second coming. It will be seen and evidenced by all, very clear. And what Jesus is going to describe for us answers the question, what exactly is this sign? Look at the first word in verse 15. In the ESV, it says, so. In some of your translations, it says, therefore. Now, that is not a chronological term. That is a connection term. So in verses 4 through 14, we've described now all of the tribulation. Now, the so or therefore word is going to connect us back into that teaching section, what's called a pericope, and Jesus is going to describe a major event within the tribulation, within the bookends of the tribulation. And so, verse 4 through 14 gives us a nice 30,000-foot view of what's going to happen. And now we're going to be dropped right smack dab in the middle into the action. What's happening there in the middle. So I want to read for us verse 15 down through verse 22. Follow along with me. It says this. So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. That's an important phrase. I would urge you to underline it, highlight it, something. Goes on, verse 16 says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. And then there will be great tribulation. That's important. Great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, and no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be short. So this describes for us the greatest discernible sign. Now keep your hand there and turn back to the prophet Daniel. Chapter 9, verse 27. Jesus expands on what the prophet Daniel tells us, but I want you to see and recognize the similar language here. Chapter 9, verse 27, prophet Daniel. Daniel writes this. And he shall make a strong covenant. Who's the he here but the Antichrist? The Antichrist will make a strong covenant with the many, that's Israel, for 1 week. That's 7 years. And for half of the week, 3.5 years, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. What's that implying? But that for half of the week, 3.5 years, 1260 days, 42 months, the Antichrist allows Jewish worship, and he allows the temple complex to run as the Jewish leaders desire for it to run. But in the second 3.5 years, he halts the sacrifice. He halts the Jewish religious practice. And he continues, on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate. Similar language from what Jesus is saying. And hear what Daniel is writing. The abomination of desolation until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. That is the judgment and the final judgment of the Antichrist. So what is Daniel telling us here? What is Jesus telling us here? In the middle of the tribulation period, at year 3.5, nearly on the dot, there will be an abomination of desolation. This is what the text tells us right here. Now, what exactly is this? It's an odd phrase, let's be honest. It's not the type of language that we use on a regular basis. So it is defined as an event that is totally and completely defiling. It's a radical pollutant. It's a loathsome thing that makes something uninhabitable. And really, it's an offense to God Himself. What is the temple? The temple is the house of God on earth. Specifically, the Holy of Holies is His footstool. It is His dwelling place on planet Earth. So, if the Antichrist were to, for example, set up a false image and enact false worship in the temple, it would radically pollute the house of God. Yes? So much so that God's presence would not dwell there. It would make it uninhabitable. The desolator does something abominable, and that's what it is describing. It is sometimes referred to as a desolating sacrilege or an abomination that causes desolation. And this event is able to disrupt and halt all worship in the tribulation temple. That's the intro on this event. Now, what's very interesting is there was a preview of this event. God does this a lot of times. He will describe something that's going to be fully completed at another date, but He will give a close, partial fulfillment or a close preview. Why does He do this? Because He wants to help us understand what exactly is coming. So there is a preview event to the abomination of desolation. Again, go back to the prophet Daniel in chapter 11. Should have told you to stay there, shouldn't I? Daniel 11 and verse 31. Check this out. Daniel writes, "Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate." Golly, you could rip that verse right out there of Daniel 11 and stick it in Matthew 24, and it matches, doesn't it? But what's interesting here is it's not describing what Jesus is describing. How do I know this? Read down for me. Look at verse 35. It says, "Some of the wise shall stumble, so they shall be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time." What is the Spirit of God saying through the prophet Daniel? This isn't the end. It's but a preview. We're still waiting for the appointed time. So when Jesus is referring to the abomination of desolation, He's not referring to an event in the past. He's referring to an event yet future. And we'll describe that more in just a moment. So what exactly is Daniel describing? Well, Daniel's describing this event, December 14, 1968 BC. The Syrian ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, grossly desecrates the temple. He erects an altar to Zeus. He sacrifices a pig in the temple. And this event in Daniel 11 is called the desolating sacrilege, the abomination of desolation. It is a preview for what the Antichrist will do in a time yet future. Now, the abomination of desolation that Jesus speaks of, it is a final event, meaning the Antichrist sets it up and it lasts until that person is destroyed and the end comes. We look at Daniel 9:27 again. It says this persists until the end of the desolator. That is the end of the age. Well, what's interesting here for Antiochus Epiphanes' action is that, yes, he was able to set up an abomination of desolation, but the Jews, particularly the Maccabees, were able to retake the Temple Mount, were able to purify the temple, they were able to purify the altar of God, and they were able to restore sacrifice. That happens December 14, 165 BC, 3 years later. This is what is celebrated at Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, that the sacrifice and the worship of the temple was reinstituted. And so again, what's described in Daniel 11 is a preview, but it's not the actual event. God wants us to understand what it's going to look like, what it's going to smell like, how horrible it's going to be, but we haven't gotten there yet. So we move on, and let's describe now the event. So the second half of the tribulation is instituted because of the abomination of desolation. This is often described as a time of extreme duress, extreme distress, extreme wrath. We can read in Revelation again how God pours out his wrath on mankind. The prophet Jeremiah calls it a time of Jacob's distress. We saw Jesus' words in Matthew 24 where he says it is a great tribulation. But here's the point. The abomination of desolation is the sign that Jewish people should look for. That when the abomination is set up, they know that Jesus is on his way. And the abomination that is described is the Antichrist being worshipped, a false image of the Antichrist being set up in the temple, an idol entering into the temple, false worship being instituted, and the false prophet celebrating it. This worship is celebrated and instituted. If you want to go back and read Revelation 17, that's where you can see that false religion come to fore. The religion of Babylon is deleted, defeated, and it's replaced by the religion of the Antichrist. Now, let's talk about the temple for just a moment. Because last week I showed you a whole bunch of pictures, and there is no temple. Temple's not there. There's another building on its foundation, the Dome of the Rock. But the way that Daniel 9 reads, the way that Daniel 11 reads, the way that Jesus speaks, it sure seems like there is a temple building with sacrifice happening. Now, many of you have studied the Bible with me for several years now, and you know my bent toward being literal. I think that Jesus tells us things. I think the apostles tells us things. I think the prophets tell us things, and I think they are meant to be taken literal as often as possible. Yes, I understand that there's metaphorical language. Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. He's not saying I'm a loaf of bread. I understand that's metaphorical, okay? But as often as we can, we should take it literally. And so when we talk about sacrifice happening in the temple, well, then the logical conclusion is the temple is going to be rebuilt. And the temple will be rebuilt on its original foundation, in its original location. That's what I personally believe. And that will be the third temple. Solomon was first, Ezra was second, Herod is 2.1 because he remodeled Ezra's temple. But the third temple is what is sometimes called the tribulation temple. When will this be rebuilt? That's the big question. Will it be rebuilt in our day? Will it be rebuilt after the rapture? Will it be rebuilt during the tribulation? Here's my view. I don't think it can be rebuilt before the church is raptured. I don't think it makes sense. I don't think it's biblical in any way. That timeline doesn't click with me. I think the tribulation temple is built after the rapture and sometime before the midpoint of the tribulation. I think that's the best and safest interpretation. If you would press me into a corner and say, come on, be a little bit more specific, we need more from you, I would say after the rapture, but before the treaty is signed. I think all 3.5 years the Jews are allowed to offer sacrifice in the temple. I think the biblical text gives us just enough wiggle room to have a time of preparation for the temple to be rebuilt and some other things to happen. But the temple is rebuilt, sacrifices are resumed. What is sometimes called the temple cult, that is just the religious practice of the Jewish individuals, is resumed in its totality. The festivals are resumed. All of this is happening, and it precedes the coming of Christ. I believe it's part of the treaty negotiation in some ways. Allow us to rebuild our temple. Allow us to start to worship again. So the tribulation temple is rebuilt. But again, the sign that we're studying here is for the abomination of desolation to happen in the temple and false worship to be instituted. So what is the instruction that Jesus gives to the faithful in this moment? He says, flee the city. When you see this happen, you are in the field. Don't go home and get your stuff. Get out of town. Don't go get your coat. Don't go get your supplies. Get out of town. In fact, it's going to be such an emergency for you to get out, you ought to pray that it won't happen in the winter. You ought to pray that it won't happen on a Sabbath. And you ought to feel bad for the pregnant and nursing mothers that will make this journey. It's going to be such an emergency. I want you to liken it in your mind. Hopefully no one has had this experience and I'm causing trauma here, but I want you to liken it in your mind that your house is burning down. What do the firefighters always tell you if your house is on fire? Get out and don't take anything. Or perhaps on a plane, if you've ridden on a plane recently, they say, hey, if the plane is going down and you have to get out, don't take your luggage, don't take your bag, don't take your laptop. Abandon everything because it's a severe danger. That's what Jesus is saying. You need to get out of town. Flee to the mountains. Don't go back for anything. The awful character of the tribulation cannot be truly grasped by us. We don't truly understand how absolutely horrific this is going to be. Now, many individuals, as they read the scripture, and I think there's good evidence for this, they believe that the place of safety that God is going to encourage these faithful followers of Jesus to escape to are the mountains of Petra, hence the image that I have here on the screen. If you've ever been to Petra, it's in Jordan today, but it's this beautiful ancient city that's carved into the hillside. It's approximately 220 kilometers from Jerusalem. It's just southwest of the Dead Sea. And it is, southeast of the Dead Sea. It is a place of safety. Now, it's interesting because Jerusalem is built on three mountains: Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, and the Mount of Olives. But they're somewhat short mountains. The mountains of Petra are quite a bit taller. And so when Jesus, in Mount of Olives, saying, get to the mountains, one would presume Jesus is saying, go to a place higher, go to a place of safety, get out of town, and wander that way. Now, while it would be a treacherous journey, of course, pedestrians could make that journey. Hence Jesus' comment, hey, really pray that you don't have to take a nursing child with you. Hey, really pray that it's not during a snowstorm. Hey, really pray that there's not going to be some sort of natural disaster at the same time, because you have to get out as quick as possible. And remember, I told you one of the aspects of the treaty that the Antichrist forms with Israel is, you don't need protection. I'm your protection. You don't need an army. I'm your army. You don't need weapons. I've got weapons. You're safe when you're with me. And when he breaks that treaty, Israel has nothing. No army, no weapons, and no ability to defend themselves. So what does Jesus say? Get out of town. Fugitives as fast as you can. And why? Because the wrath of God, not specifically centralized as if laser pointed on Jerusalem, but certainly Jerusalem will take the brunt of God's wrath, because that is the city at that point of the Antichrist. The book of Revelation, in Revelation 12:14, says that God is going to nourish Israel for time, times, and half a time. To what is that referring? This time in the wilderness, where Israel departs and flees as fugitives and goes into the mountains and are protected. The scripture also says that God is going to open up the earth after them to prevent the Antichrist from coming after them. We also see in other places of the scripture that the place of the Ammonites and the place of the Edomites will be protected from the overreach of the Antichrist. That is the place of Petra. That's Jordan. So this significant land, God will protect his faithful. It's really interesting. Psalm 60, verses 9 through 12. Perhaps as they're fleeing Jerusalem, they're praying this prayer. Listen to this. Who will bring me into the strong city, and who will lead me to Edom? Is it not you, O Lord, who cast us off? Give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. Through God we will do valiantly, for it is he who shall tread down our enemies. God promises to protect his people. It's very similar to the Exodus, where the Israelites are fleeing, Pharaoh's at their back, but God protects them by opening up the sea. It's profound. Now, I'm going to press pause on our discussion because I want to talk about some interesting archaeology. This is kind of the time where we've been in the deep end for a while and we've been treading water and we kind of need to come up for a breath of air. Is that fair? So let's come up for a breath of air. So it's some interesting archaeology. So this right here is an image of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Okay, obviously an artist rendition. There were no photographs back then. We don't know specifically what it looked like, but we can get super close. If you have an ESV study Bible, this image is in that Bible. Great images. I highly recommend that you get one of those. So if the temple is rebuilt, then the Jews are going to, as I mentioned, reinstitute sacrifice, reinstitute pilgrimage, reinstitute the feasts. And so some of these ancient places are needing to be discovered and needing to be unearthed in order for the full aspect of Jewish worship to take place. I think it's very interesting. So here on the screen, I've circled something for you. This in Jerusalem is known as the Pool of Siloam. The Pool of Siloam. Perhaps you're familiar with the story where Jesus is healing the blind man, the man born blind, and he sends the man to bathe in the Pool of Siloam. This is where it's located. So we're looking at Jerusalem. We're facing north, but we're looking at the south side of the city, okay? So as we're looking at this image. So the Pool of Siloam, it was one of the major entry points into the city, particularly for pilgrims. And they would enter, there's two gates there at the Pool of Siloam, and the pool there is used as a mikvah, okay? That's a Jewish cleansing bath. So as part of the religious practice of bringing your sacrifice is that you wanted to be washed clean, ritually pure, cleansed from any impurities in any way. So how did a Jewish person symbolize that? Well, they went down into the water, they fully immersed themselves. Does that sound familiar? Came up out of the water, and they were ritually cleansed. It was an image of God's cleansing so that they could walk the pilgrim's path up to the temple, walk up the steps, go through the gates, up into the temple, offer their sacrifice. I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. Absolutely love this stuff. So the Pool of Siloam is stop A number one for the Jewish pilgrim. This is a little bit closer image. So you see there's a gate there. You see people walking into the city. You can see the pool there, just image there by an artist rendition. Well, interestingly enough, the pool has been gone. No one knew exactly where the location was of the Pool of Siloam. There was some general idea of where it would be because of historical texts and because of descriptions that are given, but generally they didn't have, or rather specifically, they didn't have the location until 2004. And in the providence of God, check this out, a sewer line broke. And what do you do when a sewer line breaks? You bring out the heavy equipment and you start to dig. And dig they did. And they dig, and they dug, and they dug, and they dug, and all of a sudden, the earth mover, as it reached its claw down into the ground to pull up the dirt, it hit something hard, stone. And so they came and they dug a little bit more, and what did they find but stairs? Now, immediately in that moment, everything stops, because everything in Jerusalem is an archaeological find. Something is here, we don't know what it is, so let's take the time to dig it up and figure out what it is. So they dug and they dug and they dug, and what they uncovered was step after step after step going into a massive, massive pool. Several Olympic-sized pools in size. And what they determined was it is in fact the pool of Siloam. It was fed by the Gihon spring, would come down through the city and feed into the pool of Siloam. In fact, it was fed via Hezekiah's tunnel. So the spring was farther up into the city. It was protected and barricaded up because of a coming invasion by the Emperor Sennacherib. And so they protected it. Hezekiah built a tunnel to take the water down to the pool, and it became a major location for religious practice. Now, not only did they find the pool, but they also found what's called the Pilgrim's Pathway. This was also hidden. So in AD 70, when the Romans destroyed the temple, they didn't just destroy the temple and say, okay, let's leave everything else alone. And they didn't make us that mad, so we'll just destroy their temple and then they'll leave. No, they destroyed everything. One of the primary areas of destruction was known as the Old City, or the City of David. It's south of the temple complex. And what they did was they knocked down every building. And it was a big heap of destruction, covering absolutely everything. Now, since that time, city upon city has been built upon it. And so right now, it's a Muslim neighborhood in major. Much of it is being purchased by the Israelite people. But underneath it, what did they find? Well, they found a major pathway. They gave every evidence that it was a first century pathway for pilgrims. So I give you two images here. One is an artist rendition, but you can see it looks just like a spine from the pool as it weaves up to the Temple Mount, specifically to what we call today Robinson's Arch. It gave access to the southern steps of the temple. It gave access to Robinson's Arch, which is one of the major thoroughfares of traffic into the Temple Mount. But it goes right to this location. You see the model of the ancient city of Jerusalem there. This is my picture that I took a couple years ago. You see the pool of Siloam down in the corner, and then you can see the pathway that curves up to the temple. Now, why is this so interesting to me? In no way am I linking this archaeological find with what we're talking about. But it's more than just finding it interesting. Because again, when the temple is rebuilt, what will be reinstituted? All of the worship, all of the pilgrimages, all of the feasts. Jews en masse will return to Israel so that they can worship and offer sacrifice at the temple. And how will they get there? They won't roll up in Rolls Royces or BMWs or Lexus or whatever it happens to be. No, they'll walk in the southern gate. They'll walk into the pool of Siloam. They'll get their ritual purity on. And then they will walk up step by step, brick by brick, cobblestone by cobblestone, up to the temple. They'll walk in and they'll offer their sacrifice. In fact, there's a whole set of psalms in the book of Psalms that are specifically for this. They're called the Psalms of Ascent. As soon as they entered into the city, they would begin to sing these psalms. Psalms of repentance, psalms of relationship with God, psalms of closeness with God. God, come and heal us, come and heal our nation, so on and so forth. And these are actions of worship, all part of the religious complex. Now, the reason why I bring this to your attention is I find it profound, interesting, and terrific that these things are being found in our time. For hundreds, thousands of years, they left covered by rubble, but today they're being profound. I think it's absolutely profound. Today, more than ever before, the things of the temple can be reinstituted without much work. So let's talk about what follows. The sign happens, of course. We see that in the text, but then what happens after that? Jesus says there's going to be a time of horrific persecution unleashed. A time, Jesus says, of great tribulation. We talked about that a moment ago, but there's also going to be a time of, or rather an outpouring of diabolical and deceptive miracles. The minions of the Antichrist, the minions of the false prophet are going to do whatever they possibly can to deceive the elect away from believing in Jesus. And they will have tremendous and fantastical powers. Things that we can't even begin to understand. And during this time of great tribulation, you should go and read this week. The seals were broken in the first 3.5 years, but in the second 3.5 years, the trumpets are blown. And the bowls of God's wrath are poured out. That's Revelation 8 through 11 and Revelation chapter 16. Now, I told you just a moment ago, I firmly believe that what Jesus is describing here in Matthew 24 is not describing what happened in AD 70. I firmly believe that. There is without a shadow of a doubt in my mind that Jesus is referring to an event yet future. And I think there's some major clues in the text that help us understand this. Number one, Matthew 23 as a backdrop or as an occasion for this text gives us all kinds of understanding. Matthew 23 verse 39 specifically says, "For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" There's a yet future fulfillment of Zechariah 12:10. And that happens after the time of tribulation as described by the prophets. So that's one piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is when Jesus refers to Daniel's prophecy. Look back at the text in verse 15. He says all of this is spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Jesus doesn't hide where he's drawing this from. And he's saying, look at the prophet Daniel. He describes it for us. And as we looked at Daniel's prophecy, it gave us understanding into this is yet future. Another element of this is the phrase, "let the reader understand." I want to read this quotation because I find this to be fascinating. This is John MacArthur's quotation. He says this: "The exhortation, 'let the reader understand,' reinforces the fact that Jesus was not giving the warning in the Olivet Discourse to the disciples themselves. They weren't reading it. They were hearing it. So he's not warning the disciples of what was to come in AD 70, which every single one of them lived through. No. Write this down, and it is for another generation." MacArthur continues and says, "This is for believers in the end time, who will read these truths in Scripture and thereby be enabled to understand the trials they are enduring." You know, one of the reasons why I put this up on YouTube is because if the Antichrist allows YouTube to continue, perhaps maybe there'll be a tribulation Bible study to hear this out. How cool would that be? And they're going, okay, well, you're gone, so you're there, so help us understand what's coming next. So if you're tuning in, come on. Endure to the end. Get to Petra. You see what I'm saying? But they're going to read these things and have understanding into the text that will help them survive until the end. And then, of course, the term Great Tribulation, we talked about that, and also the phrase, "and never will be." I think this is a major evidence for us. Because what is being described is a time, again, of Jacob's distress, a time that is so severe, nothing ever will come close. Now, AD 70 was bad. Hear me out. It was bad. If you read some of the historical accounts, it was bad. But it doesn't compare to the Holocaust. It doesn't compare to the pogroms against the Jewish people. It doesn't compare against the persecution of the Jewish people in Russia. It doesn't compare, in some cases, what they're experiencing today at the hands of Hamas and other terrorist regimes. And so this causes us some questions. If Matthew 24 is referring to AD 70, here are four major questions that we have to answer. Number one, what was the desolating sacrilege? Number two, how do we answer and never will be? That's a problem. How do we answer the days are cut short? That's also a problem because we're still here. And lastly, what about the great signs and wonders in verse 24? What are those? Now, in my opinion, there are no answers to those questions because it doesn't match. It's a great commentator. His name is John Nolan. He says this: one looks in vain in Josephus' account, that is the major historian that writes all of this down. He says, one looks in vain in Josephus' account of the Jerusalem war for a distinct event that would stand out clearly as deserving the label, the desolating sacrilege. He continues, not on your screen, but he says, and especially for one that marks a sharp divide between a time when the people in Judea are best advised to stay put and a time when they needed to flee at once for their lives. In other words, there is no historical time period that matches what Jesus is referencing, meaning it hasn't yet happened. It is yet future. It's off in the distance. John MacArthur says this: it seems more sensible and more consistent, therefore, to take a futurist approach with respect to the Olivet Discourse, to interpret the entire discourse as a prophetic picture of a generation and events that would take place long after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. I agree. This is a future event. At the conclusion of this future event, Jesus describes some very specific things that are going to be happening. Number one, he says there will be increased deception. Look at verse 23 through 28. It says this: then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So we see this chronological term again. Then. To what period is it referring to? It's referring to the period of time after the abomination of desolation. And what's going to be happening during this time, but false Christs and false prophets are going to arise in a level that we've never seen before on planet Earth. Yes, I understand that false prophets, false teachers are a hallmark of this inter-Advent age. But after the abomination, Satan is going to do whatever he possibly can to deceive. He knows that his number is up. He knows that he is a defeated foe. He knows his destination forever and always is the lake of fire. So he's going to do whatever he can to take people with him. In some ways, I wonder if Satan will be more motivated to take people with him than churchgoers are motivated to take people to heaven. Satan is motivated. And he's going to use whatever at his disposal he can to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So much false information is going to be disseminated, for false Christ will be all around, preaching alternative messages of salvation, performing signs and wonders, trying to validate the message that they have in their lips. This is going to be specifically happening as the refugees are fleeing Jerusalem. Satan will send his false prophets and his minions to try to say, don't go, come back, Jesus is here already. Come in, he's in the inner room. Come, he's out in the wilderness. Come with us, we'll take him to you, which is sure destruction. They must be diligent, and they must go to the place of safety. There's an implied question here in the text. How will we know when Jesus comes back? How will we know that it is safe to return? How will we know that the coast is clear and the enemy of God is defeated? Jesus gives the answer, doesn't he? He says, the lightning comes from east to west, flashes even to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. What is Jesus saying, Buzz? It will be evident to everyone. Everyone. No one will escape the knowledge that Jesus has returned. It won't be difficult to identify. In fact, as we read the New Testament text in Revelation, it describes Jesus' second coming. The heavens are ripped open, and here comes Jesus on his white horse, and behind him armies, us, on our white horses. It won't be difficult to miss. It will be clear that Jesus has returned. Now, there's this very interesting phrase here at the end of this section that I just read. It talks about vultures. And you're like, what in the world is Jesus talking about? Seems very bizarre to throw in this proverb. What are you trying to prove here, Jesus? It's interesting, isn't it? And so here's what I believe the best interpretation of this is. And by the way, as you read through the commentary literature, there's about 45 different interpretations. So if you don't like mine, go find your own. But here's what I think is best, okay? So if you've ever been someplace where an animal has died, vultures start to circle, right? It's like they come out of nowhere, right? And you can see vultures circling for miles and miles and miles and miles. You see them off in the distance. What's that? Oh, it's vultures. There must be something dead. They're going to come down and grab the carcass. I believe Jesus, what he's saying here is, just as visible as those vultures will be across the miles, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. But with that said, there'll be a great corpse. What's the corpse? An unbelieving, dead, destroyed, and judged world. And Jesus will return in the clouds, and his judgment will return with him. Jesus is coming again. And in Jesus' first coming, how did he come? He came lowly and humble and meek, laid in a manger, a carpenter. Jesus says of himself, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. But when he comes again, his feet will touch the Mount of Olives, and he will come as a reigning king. He will march once again across the Kidron Valley and up into the temple, and he will be the Messianic king. He will establish his kingdom, and he will make all things right. That is the second coming event, and that's where we need to go. Look at chapter 24, verse 29 through 31. It says this: immediately after, just in case you didn't figure out what the timing is, Jesus makes it clear. The word here immediately is euthus. Euthus, it means without delay. Without delay after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. So what is being described? Immediately, again, immediately after. So immediately after, but verse 22 tells us that the second coming cuts the days of the tribulation short. That doesn't mean it's less than 1,260 days plus 1,260 days. No, it is, thank God Jesus has arrived or nobody would be alive. For the sake of the elect, Jesus comes to save them. And when he comes, he cuts the tribulation short. And it will be accompanied by cosmic signs. And I've given you in your text a whole bunch of scripture passages that speak to this. From the prophets, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Joel, Amos, Haggai. They all speak to this. They speak of these great cosmic signs before Jesus comes back. And then the sign of the Son of Man. Now, we don't know specifically what this is, if I'm honest with you. Through conjecture, I would say this. I think it refers us back to Daniel 7, verse 13 and 14. And let me just describe this moment to you as Daniel sees it. Daniel says he looks up into the heavens and he sees the Ancient of Days, the one who has always existed, the Alpha, the Omega, the Ancient of Days, and he's seated on his throne. And one comes from behind him that is like a son of man. Now, this is a Trinitarian moment. The Ancient of Days, clearly God the Father. The one coming from behind him is clearly God the Son. And he says, one like a son of man. And did you know that in the Gospels, when Jesus is ministering on earth, that he, more often than any other name, calls himself the Son of Man? He uses it 30 times in Matthew's Gospel, 14 times in Mark, 25 times in Luke, 13 times in John. Once in Acts, it's referring to Jesus, and 2 times in Revelation, the Son of Man. What does this phrase mean? I'm borrowing this, but I think this is good. Number one, it's a title of humanity. Jesus is 100% man. It's a title of humility. He is the Son of Man. It's a title of deity. This is a title that resounds the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, and it's a title of prophecy fulfillment. The sign of the Son of Man. That is the appearing of Jesus. It's very possible that that moment that Daniel had looking up into the heavens in Daniel 7, he saw the second coming of Jesus. He just saw it thousands of years before it took place. The sign of the Son of Man. The other thing that it tells us is there will be a gathering. There'll be a gathering of the elect. And these are the gathering of those faithful that are still alive at the time of Jesus' coming. Those who are enduring and those who are persevering. Remember, they scattered due to persecution. They're all in Petra. And so the angels go and gather the faithful, gather the elect from their places of safety and bring them to Jesus. Now, there's lots of instances where Jesus describes this in the Gospels. One is the parable of the weeds in Matthew 13. One is the parable of the net in Matthew 13. These are known as the parables of the kingdom. And then one is the parable of the sheep and goats. We'll look at that in a couple weeks. Now, this is a trumpet call, but it is not the rapture. I made mention to you last week that the Olivet Discourse does not reference the rapture. It's not contained in this text in Matthew 24 or 25. Someone tells you that it's there, it's not there, because this passage is specifically to the people of Israel. So this trumpet call is not the rapture, but this trumpet call is to gather the elect. And I firmly believe here, friends, that this also includes the resurrection of the Old Testament saint. God promises Daniel in Daniel 12 that the Old Testament saint would be resurrected. Check this out. Daniel 12, verses 1 through 3 says this: "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered. Everyone whose name shall be found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. But those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like stars forever and ever. The resurrection of the Old Testament saint. Now that brings conclusion to Jesus' teaching on the events. That brings conclusion to our understanding of what the sign is. Hopefully, if you haven't gotten anything else out of today, you know what the sign is. The abomination of desolation. Everything else that follows is application. Everything else that follows is practical for us to understand how we then shall live now. And so this is where we press pause tonight. Now, there are some folks that say that Israel's regathering into the land is extremely prophetic. It fulfills a lot of what is being described here in Matthew 24. And I want to do some comparison with you really quickly. So Israel's the present first regathering. That is what happened when Israel was brought back into the land and the nation was established, May 14, 1948. These are the characteristics. Where did they come from? It was worldwide. Where did they return to? They returned to part of the land. We see that even today politically, correct? With Gaza and et cetera, et cetera. They don't have full possession of the land. And if you look at the land covenant all the way through, Israel has never possessed all of the land promised to them. They return in unbelief. I mentioned this last week, but you walk the streets in Israel and you speak to Jewish person after Jewish person after Jewish person. Many of them are agnostic. Many of them are atheist. Many of them have completely abandoned all of the things of God. They returned in unbelief. They were restored to the land only. It sets the stage for the tribulation. It sets the stage for a time of discipline, and they are but a political entity. An ally for us, of course. But as we look at what's described in the future gathering of the Israelite people, what do we find? We find again a worldwide regathering. We find that they're going to return to all the land as promised in the land covenant. They won't return in unbelief, they'll return in belief. We studied this in the book of Zechariah, where they'll look on him in whom they pierced, and they'll mourn and they'll weep in repentance, crying out in faith to their Messiah. They're going to be restored to the land and the Lord. And this sets the stage for the millennial kingdom. Not a time of discipline, but a time of untold blessing. And Christ's kingdom is established. Friends, that's what we're looking for. That's what we're hoping for when we pray things like, "Your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." We're begging God to bring that into a reality. But before that can happen, we know that there's an intense time of persecution and wrath and judgment that God pours out. I want to end with this slide tonight. I intentionally am not going to spoon feed you the application of these passages. I intentionally want you to take a few moments and interact with the text on your own. Scripture tells us that if you're a believer, you have the Holy Spirit. He comes to live inside you. He is our comforter. He is our helper. And He enlightens our mind to understand the text. I've given you a lot of understanding tonight, but as we've talked about before, you can't just study the text for knowledge and then abandon the application. So how does one drill down and figure out, how do I apply these truths? How do I apply these ideas? Well, oftentimes we need to ask ourselves questions. And this is really simple. And the reason why I give this to you is because nearly every time I sit down and study the Word, I walk through these questions. Nearly every time I prepare to teach a lesson, I walk through these questions. Because I want to hear, Spirit of God, what are you doing to me? What is the life change you're enacting in me? What is the transformation you want to see in me as I study this passage? So we've studied a lot, but let's just take a couple by example. Is there a command I need to obey? In this passage, is there a command I need to obey? I think it's hidden underneath, but the command I need to obey is to tell as many people about Jesus so they don't experience this. That's certainly one way that I can apply this passage. There is, in other words, an extreme urgency for us to get the gospel out. Yes? Is there something I need to avoid? Interesting. Well, Jesus talks a lot about being deceived. He talks a lot about being led astray. He talks a lot about misunderstanding. And so I need to spend time to ensure that I know what God is telling me. Does the exercise make sense? So I'm going to give you a task before you leave. And here's what I want you to do. At your table, I want you to choose one of the questions. Somebody can lead out and choose the question. I don't care what question you have. But just discuss it quickly. What is the application when we look at this question? Fair? Good community moment here for us. Okay? We don't do this often, but I really like this idea as we want to close out this section. Let me pray, and then I'm going to give it to you. Father, I pray that you would bless this time of discussion around these tables. Father, I pray that a question right now off of the screen would come to mind. And Father, that this question, that they are ready to tackle and ready to seek application of the word that we've studied tonight. Father, I'm grateful that the Spirit of God lives within us and brings understanding and brings application and convicts us of sin and helps us to live out the truth. So Spirit of God, do that in these moments right now. In Jesus' name, amen.